Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're jumping straight into the money behind the 2020 U.S. presidential general election.
Yeah, a really fascinating and, well, complex topic.
Absolutely. And you, our listeners, want that quick but thorough understanding. And that's exactly what we aim for. We've got a good amount of info here breaking down, how the Biden and Trump campaigns raised and spent funds during that really intense final stretch.
So our mission in this deep dive really is to shed some light on the financial forces that were at play, trying to understand who funded the campaigns, how the money got used,
Right.
giving everyone a clear picture of what was going on sort of behind the scenes.
Exactly. We're focusing on Joe Biden and Donald Trump, comparing their financial operations, specifically during the general election period. Now, this period is actually really important under campaign finance law. It kicks off after the party conventions, late August 2020, and runs through that post-election reporting deadline, November 23rd.
That late August timing is key, yeah.
Yeah.
Because, legally speaking, the conventions are the signal. That's when the general election period officially starts for campaign finance. Contribution limits, other rules, they shift then.
Good point. And we have to remember 2020 saw just, an unprecedented level of spending overall. So understanding the money side is pretty crucial to really grasping the election's dynamics, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely critical. The scale was enormous.
Okay, so let's start with the big picture then. General election spending. What's the main headline finding?
The most striking thing, it's the clear financial advantage for Joe Biden and his allied groups. Our sources show that between roughly late August and late November 2020, they spent, get this, an estimated $1.68 billion.
$1.68 billion. That's a massive figure. How did the Trump campaign compare?
Well, Donald Trump and his allied groups during that same period spent approximately $1.06 billion.
Okay, so 1.68 versus 1.06 billion.
Right. That's a difference of over $600 million. It's a really, really substantial gap.
Wow. Over $500 million more on the Biden side. Okay, and just to, quickly remind everyone of that time frame again, it's after the DNC and RNC conventions in August 2020.
Mid to late August, yeah.
Running until November 23rd, which was after Election Day when those post-general reports were due.
Precisely. The conventions are that dividing line, officially, for the finance rules between the primaries and the general.
Got it. So where's all this data coming from? I mean, who's tracking these huge sums?
The main source is the official paperwork, the filing submitted to the Federal Election Commission, the FEC.
Okay.
They're the regulatory body.
Yeah.
And their records are public, which is great for transparency on, contributions and spending.
And it's not just the campaigns themselves, right? You mentioned allied groups. What about them?
Exactly. We also rely quite a bit on analysis from nonpartisan orgs like Issue One and OpenSecrets.org. They do the hard work of digging through that raw FEC data, synthesizing it, giving us context and breakdowns. And yeah, it's really important to understand the difference between the official campaign committee, Biden for president or Donald J. Trump for president,
right,
and these outside groups, things like super PACs, other independent expenditure committees. Legally, they can't coordinate with the campaigns on strategy or spending, but they can raise and spend unlimited amounts of money to support or attack candidates. Our analysis includes spending by both types.
Okay, that makes sense. So let's dive into the specifics then. Start with Joe Biden's fundraising, just for that general election period. How much did his actual campaign committee pull in?
So the estimate for the Biden campaign committee itself during the general is around $524 million.
$524 million, okay.
And just for context, over the entire 2020 cycle, his campaign committee raised over $1 billion. $1.044 billion, actually, and the outside group supporting him. Another $580 million across the whole cycle.
Okay, so $1 billion for the campaign over the whole cycle, $580 million for the outside groups. Now, digging into where the campaign's money came from, based on that full cycle data, what were the main sources? Because we don't have the specific general election breakdown for sources, right?
That's correct, yeah. The detailed source breakdown is typically cycle-wide. So looking at the full 2020 cycle for the Biden campaign committee, the biggest chunk, about 61%, came from large individual contributions.
Meaning over $200.
Exactly, over $200. That totaled about $646 million. Small individual contributions, so $200 or less, they were also significant. Made up roughly 38%, which is about $406.6 million.
Okay, so about 60-40 split, leaning towards larger individual checks for the campaign itself?
Pretty much. And other receipts were tiny. Interestingly, no significant self-funding from him, And he didn't take federal funds either.
Right. So heavily reliant on individual donors, especially those giving larger amounts for the official campaign. Now, what about those outside groups supporting Biden? Where did their money come from? That $580 million.
Yeah, the outside groups backing Biden?
Yep.
That's kind of a different story. Again, the data is mostly cycle-wide, but it shows a really significant reliance on huge contributions from wealthy individuals and organizations.
Like who? Any big names jump out?
Oh, yeah. We saw massive contributions from people like Michael Bloomberg. Labor unions were big, too, like the SEIU, the Laborers Union. Dustin Moskovitz, the Asana co-founder, was another major donor.
Mm-hmm.
There was Future Forward USA, a big super PAC, reportedly got funding from Bill Gates. And you also have to mention the role of dark money groups.
Ah, okay. Explain that a bit.
Well, groups like the 1630 Fund, they're often called dark money because they're typically set up as like social welfare organizations, 501c4s, and they aren't legally required to disclose who their donors are.
So the money trail goes cold.
Pretty much. Makes their funding sources opaque. But these outside groups, they collected enormous sums, allowing them to run tons of ads, support get-out-the-vote efforts, things the campaign couldn't directly control.
Okay, so it sounds like maybe a different strategy there, with allies focusing on those independent efforts.
It certainly suggests that, yeah. A lot of independent advertising, voter mobilization, funded by that big outside money.
Interesting. So while Biden's campaign had a decent small dollar base, the whole effort, once you add in those outside groups, really lean heavily on those mega contributions.
Okay, let's pivot to Donald Trump.
Oh, yeah.
How did his fundraising look during that same general election period?
So the estimate for the Trump Campaign Committee is about $308.4 million raised during that specific general election timeframe.
Okay, $308 million.
Yes.
Less than Biden's campaign.
Yes. And over the full 2020 cycle, his campaign committee brought in roughly $774 million. Outside groups supporting him raised around $314 million over the cycle.
Got it. $774 million for the campaign, $314 million for outside groups across the whole cycle. Now, looking at the funding sources for Trump's campaign committee over the full cycle, what stands out there? This is where it gets really fascinating, actually. It's almost an even split between large and small individual contributions for his campaign.
Really?
Yeah. Large contributions, over $200, they accounted for about 51%, maybe $396.2 million. But small contributions, under $200, made up roughly 49%, totaling $378.1 million.
Wow, nearly 50-50.
Exactly. It really highlights the strength of Trump's small dollar fundraising base. That was a significant engine for his campaign committee.
That is a very different picture from the Biden campaign committee's 60-40 split.
Very different. And similar to Biden, minimal self-financing, no federal funds accepted. But yeah, that near-even split, it speaks volumes about either his base or, a very deliberate fundraising strategy targeting those smaller donors consistently.
So almost half his campaign money came in those smaller chunks. What about the outside group supporting Trump, that $314 million? Who are their key funders? Was it similar?
Not quite. The outside groups backing Trump tended to rely on a, let's say, smaller number of very large donors, mega donors. A prime example is Sheldon and Miriam Adelson. They gave a massive $75 million to the Preserve America PAC quite late in the election cycle, actually.
$75 million from one couple. Wow.
Yeah. Timothy Mellon was another major contributor to pro-Trump groups. So while Trump's campaign had that incredibly strong small dollar base, the big outside money supporting him came from a much more concentrated pool of very wealthy individuals.
Interesting contrast. Maybe suggests, I don't know, a more centralized approach within his campaign compared to Biden's allies?
That could be an interpretation, yeah. There are fewer major players funding the outside efforts.
Okay, so we've seen how the money came in. Now, the crucial part.
Right.
How was it spent during the general election? Let's start with Biden again. Campaign and outside groups. What did they spend?
Right, spending. Estimates show the Biden campaign committee spent about $1.01 billion during the general election period.
$1 billion. Wait, they only raised $524 million in that period.
Exactly. Which is interesting, right? It suggests they were burning through funds they'd accumulated earlier in the cycle.
Makes sense. And the outside groups supporting Biden?
They're estimated to have spent $668 million during that same general election window.
Okay, so really significant spending from both the campaign and the allied groups. Now, the Trump side, how much did they spend in the general?
The Trump campaign committee is estimated to have spent $710 million.
$710 million. Again, that's more than the $308 million they raised in the period.
Correct. Same pattern drawing on funds raised earlier. And the outside groups supporting Trump. They spent an estimated $349 million during this period.
Okay, let's put those spending numbers directly side by side. It sounds like a big difference, but let's see the totals.
Absolutely. Let's compare directly.
Mm-hmm.
For Biden, total estimated general election spending, $1.678 billion. That breaks down as $1.01 billion from the campaign committee.
Okay.
And $668 million from outside groups.
Got it. $1.608 billion total for Biden.
And Trump.
For Trump. Total estimated spending, $1.059 billion. That's $710 million spent by the campaign. And $349 million by the outside groups. Wow. Okay, so looking at those totals, $1.68 billion versus $1.06 billion. That $600 million gap we talked about in fundraising clearly translated into spending.
It absolutely did. Biden and his allies outspent Trump and his allies across the board. The difference is pretty stark, both in what the actual campaign spent and maybe even more dramatically in the spending by those outside groups.
Yeah, let's look at that. Biden's campaign spent roughly $300 million more than Trump's campaign.
Right.
$1 1B versus $710.
Roughly, yes. And the pro-Biden outside group spent $668 million compared to $349 million for the pro-Trump groups. That's nearly double. Difference of about $319 million just on the outside spending.
Nearly double the outside spending for Biden. That's a huge disparity.
It really is. A clear financial advantage in both categories for the Biden side during that crucial period.
Were there any, noticeable differences in how they spent it? Or is it just, more volume means more ads, more outreach?
Well, the sources we're looking at mainly focus on the total amounts, the top-line figures. But, that huge difference in outside group spending, it does suggest potentially different priorities or capabilities.
How so?
Biden's allies likely just had a much greater capacity for things like independent TV advertising, digital ads, maybe extensive voter mobilization efforts, all separate from what the official campaign was doing. More resources means more reach, generally.
Okay. So summing up the spending side then, what are the main takeaways?
I think the most significant takeaway is just that undeniable overall spending advantage for Biden and his allies during the general election.
Right.
And it wasn't just a slight edge,
Yeah.
It was substantial. You saw it in the campaign spending, but even more starkly with those outside groups. The pro-Biden outside groups spent vastly more.
And the implication is?
Well, it's reasonable to infer, at least, that this financial edge probably translated into a greater ability to get their message out, to reach voters through ads, mail, digital, and also maybe to fund bigger, more extensive get-out-the-vote operations on the ground. Money doesn't guarantee votes, obviously, but it buys access and amplification.
Okay, so wrapping up this deep dive then, the main point that really jumps out is that Joe Biden and his allies just had a considerably larger financial footprint spending-wise in the 2020 general election compared to Donald Trump and his supporters.
That's the headline, yes.
Yeah.
Significantly more spending. And we also saw those interesting contrasts in how the money was raised, right?
Yeah, remind us.
Biden's campaign leaned more on large individual donors, percentage-wise. Trump's campaign had that amazing near-even split, really strong small dollar support. But when you look at the total picture, especially including those big outside groups,
Right.
Biden's overall financial effort seems to have been more reliant on those very large contributions from wealthy individuals, unions, and potentially those dark money sources, whereas Trump's outside support relied on fewer but extremely large mega donors.
Fascinating differences in the structure of their funding. This has been a really insightful look, peeling back the layers on the money side of 2020.
It's complex, but important context.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? How might that significant financial disparity in the general election, that $600 million spending gap, how might that have influenced the outcome? Or even just what do these different spending patterns tell us about the campaign's strategies, their priorities, maybe even the motivations of their supporters?
Yeah.
It definitely leaves you wondering about the larger role money plays in our politics. Are these huge sums reflective of, broad popular support? Or are other more concentrated financial forces becoming more decisive? Something to mull over. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.